Welcome to everybody here today. It's great to see so many people. It's been a very tricky year, I think, that we're reporting on here in today's annual report, with a particular focus on the risks we're seeing from more drugs getting into prison, particularly with drugs brought in on drones. And what we're seeing in some jails is they're being hit very hard. So prisons like Hindley up in the northwest, with random testing showing about 58% of prisoners under the influence, which is highly concerning because where we see high levels of drugs coming into prison, what we see as a result of it is high levels of violence because drugs equals debt, and sadly, prison debts are often paid off with violence. But also, this has a knock-on effect in terms of purposeful activity as well, because what we're often finding is that attendance and education is really poor, either because it's been cancelled or because there aren't enough staff to escort people, or because prisoners, particularly if they have been taking drugs, simply don't want to turn up. So that is a really big concern. So levels of violence have gone up in our prisons in the last year. We're seeing the amount of drugs getting into prison growing substantially. In the youth estate, we continue to be enormously concerned by what we see, particularly in the three public sector YOIs, where levels of violence are very high, where there are big keep apart lists, so lots of children unable to mix, and that restricts the regime that's available, which then means that education is often not the priority that we would want to see. And then finally, just to mention the women's estate, we put a thematic out called Time to Care about the things that will help women to cope better in prison. And some of them are really basic, like making sure they've got proper underwear, making sure they've got proper clothes, making sure that they're able to get really decent family visits. So lots of things we're critical about in this report, but also I just want to flag some of the real positives that we've seen over the course of the year. Jails like Oakwood, jails like Hatfield, jails like Cardiff and Rye Hill, doing really well despite some of the difficulties that we see. So that's been a real pleasure for the inspection teams to go along. And also some jails where we've had urgent notification in the past, Wood Hill, Bedford and Bristol. We returned for a review of progress in all those jails. And again, it was encouraging to see that some progress had been made in those hard to run prisons. So back to you, Danny. A quick summary there from me, and interested to get into the questions.
Thanks, Charlie. Let's start with the drugs problem at the moment. Your report says there's an unprecedented amount of illegal drugs getting into prisons, and much of it is coming in through drones, Manchester, Long Lartin in particular, you identify. Why has this threat escalated? And has the response, in your view, been sort of not keeping pace with it? What needs to be done to try and address it?
Well, certainly, the drone technology has developed a lot over the last few years, and almost inevitably, quite quickly, criminals worked out that this was a very good way of being able to deliver a package of contraband to potentially a cell window with the sorts of technology that you can now use in order to be able to do that, which means a drone can fly in, drop a big package off in a prison and be out again. And we're seeing sometimes packages of up to 11 kilos of contraband getting into prisons, which is really difficult. But so that's a huge issue. You've also got a population, some of whom already have drug problems. Sadly, we're seeing lots of people developing drug problems while they're in prison, partly because they're just bored. And we're also seeing physical security not being good enough in lots of jails. So Long Lartin, a prison that holds some of the riskiest men in the country. Manchester prison, similarly, we saw CCTV not working properly. There wasn't adequate netting in place. In Manchester, the windows were being breached. They put replacement windows in. Those windows were being breached by prisoners as well. And we're beginning to see some potential technological solutions as well out there. But it has taken a very long time, I think, for the prison service really to begin to get a grip of the challenge that is posed by drones. And what we're really seeing is levels of criminality inside prisons as a result of this that are really worryingly high.
Now, we know that drones are bringing in drugs. I think there have also been some cases where they brought weapons in. you've floated the possibility that, with the advance of technology, they could even potentially help a prisoner escape. Can you just explain what you mean by that? Is that just fanciful, or is that
Well, it's
something
a
that
it's of course a theoretical possibility, and it's something that I hope we don't come to that, because I hope that the response from the Ministry of Justice will deal with this will deal with this drone issue, and we begin to reduce the threat that we're getting from drones. But in theory, it's possible. Drones have bigger and bigger payloads. We're seeing that with stuff being brought into prison, so it's something the prison service absolutely needs to take seriously.
Now, how is this relating to violence in terms of organised violence? Are we seeing an upsurge in violence across the estate because of the drugs coming in? And how is that interrelated to sort of the issues around lack of purposeful activity, overcrowding, too many inmates just stuck in their cells for 22, 23 hours a day?
Well, absolutely. What we know is that we've seen in recently published stats from the Ministry of Justice, we've seen that the assaults between prisoners have gone up by 10% in the last year. We've seen that assaults on staff have gone up by 13% in the last year. So where we have drugs in a prison, you get debt, and where you have debt in a prison, debts get settled, sadly, in many cases by violence. So when you have this sort of criminality, where you have prisoners, many of whom are under the influence within prison, it makes life really difficult to be able to. It increases the amount of violence that we see in jails, and it becomes a real pressure then, because staff go to work and they're worried about whether they're going to get assaulted or not. Other prisoners are feeling nervous and wary about moving around the place. Relationships inevitably deteriorate, and it makes prisoners worried about going to things like education, to training, to skills. So yes, that absolutely is a feeder of many of the problems we see.
I think you also mentioned in your report the importance of leadership, and where you've seen examples of leaders not setting boundaries and not enforcing rules with motivating cultures, that's where the violence can escalate. Can you explain a bit about that, and perhaps some examples of where you're seeing good practice in terms of leadership and where it's not so good?
Yeah, the really, the best, you don't become a good prison leader because you're visible around and about your prison. But what we find is all the prisons where we're really positive about leadership, all the best prisons, everybody knows who the governor is. Everybody knows who's in charge of the place. And it's really depressing for me when I go into prisons and I actually find that people ask me whether I'm the governor. And sometimes I say, do you know if the governor's a man or a woman? And in some jails, people don't have any idea. So leadership is absolutely critical. And we're blessed with some outstanding governors in this country who do a really amazingly good job. And what those good leaders are doing is they're really clear about their standards. They're really clear about the behaviour they expect, both from prisoners and also the response that they expect from their officers, about what the job entails, about how they want them to do that job. They're really clear about the rules within the jail, and there are consequences for doing the wrong thing, but also consequences for doing the right thing as well. So when you visit a prison like Oakwood, just outside Wolverhampton, what you find is that prisoners are really motivated to behave, because there are loads of things that they get if they do behave well. They get better visits. They get opportunities to move more around the prison. They get to be less supervised on some sorts of activities. So there are some really big incentives in a jail like that. We go to other places. A prison officer came to see me once about a jail and said, in my prison, there is no consequence for doing the right thing, and there is no consequence for doing the wrong thing. So strong leadership is absolutely at the heart of improving behavior within prisons. It makes an enormous difference, but also about increasing the capability of staff generally, particularly officers. And we see that a lot, where the best officers make an enormous difference. They set standards on the wing, they hold their colleagues to account. They're seen as reliable by prisoners, people you can trust, people who say they're going to do something, who, when they say they're going to do something, they do it. And that too makes a great difference.
So what is holding back the spreading of that best practice of leadership, of effective leadership in every prison, and effective staff practice in every prison? What's holding that back? Why do we have those brilliant leaders who you've seen in Oakwood and elsewhere, right across the prison estate, do you think?
Well, I think one of the advantages that the private sector has got has been that it has a bit more flexibility. What governors will say to me is they're able to do things in the private sector that they're not able to do within the public sector. So they have more flexibility, for example, about how they're able to spend their money. I mean, I'm really shocked. I'm a former head teacher. I used to run a school, and I'm really shocked by when I visit schools and I find that, sorry, when I visit prisons, and I find that the amount of freedoms I had as a head teacher are nothing compared, nothing like those that a prison governor has. So prison governors don't have any say over the officers who come and work in their prison. They're not involved in the recruitment process. They are incredibly restricted in the amount of money that they spend. One governor told me recently they wanted to get a new washing machine. They had to go through some protracted process to be able to do that. If they want to get a pot of paint, they have to go through a central procurement rather than simply going down to their local B&Q. HR functions. One governor said to me, my HR, this is a prison up in the northwest, the governor said, my HR advisor, it lives somewhere down in the southwest of England. I've never met them. And I'm not able to get the timely sorts of advice that I need. So often governors say that they're really tied up in bureaucratic processes rather than doing the stuff that's really going to make the difference. And that's about leading their staff, about being visible about the jail, about setting clear standards and making sure that they have the right people with the right capabilities in the most important jobs.
Yes, I think there's a phrase in your report where you talked about plodding managerialism, which is valued more than transformative leadership. You've mentioned the bureaucratic management and oversight from the prison service. I don't know, we may have some people from HMPPS or Ministry of Justice listening in, watching this webcast. What is your message to them, Charlie?
Well, I think it's to trust the best professionals to get on and do the job. You know, there are outstanding leaders. I'm amazed by the dedication of prison governors when I travel in prisons around the country. But let's think about them as the most important cog in this wheel. How do we enable prison governors? How do we enable their bosses as prison group directors to really be able to have the most influence, to really be able to affect things? And I think, Danny, the biggest frustration for me as chief inspector of prisons at times is that we are holding people to account for stuff that they are not entirely responsible for. So we're very critical of conditions very often that we find within prisons. Governors say to me, I've been waiting for months, for years in some cases, to get this fixed, to get a new flooring put in, to get agreement for new showers to be able to put in. So that for them is a huge source of frustration. There are aspects with the education contract, with the health contract, which often get in the way of them being able to deliver a really good service for prisoners.
Now, you've talked many times in previous reports about overcrowding, the lack of purposeful activity, and that's still a serious problem. But how much have the difficulties in the past year been exacerbated by the early release scheme that the government introduced, SDS 40, where inmates were released after serving 40% rather than 50% of their sentence? How has that affected regimes and the movement between various different prisons?
Well, I think the government were in a difficult position and they had to make a decision very quickly. There was danger that the prison estate was going to simply fall over quite quickly if they didn't take action very fast. But things are still very tight within prisons. So many prisons, even though prisons are in danger of overflowing at the moment, there are still some very overcrowded prisons. You go to somewhere like Bedford, you go to somewhere like Leeds, and you're finding lots of men sharing cells that were originally doubled up, which are originally designed for one person. So that makes life difficult. It also means that people are moving out of prisons incredibly quickly. So in reception prisons, almost the entire population is on remand. Or on a very brief recall. That makes the population very transient. As soon as someone's sentenced, they get shipped out very quickly. I mean, I was at Elmley Prison the other day, and we came across a prisoner who was being shipped out for one day. So the guy had one day left to serve, and was suddenly told he was going in a van to Rochester. You can see how that puts a huge amount of pressure on the individual prisoner, but also that you've got to put a van on for him. You've got to organise a new place for him in a new jail. He's got to contact his family and make sure they can come and pick him up. So that kind of absolute pressure on moving people around is enormous at the moment within jails, and we see that elsewhere as well. So Category C prisons are often holding a very transient population, people who are there for a much shorter periods of time, and of course that makes it much harder for them to be able to do the real training work that they need to do in order to be able to get people work ready when they come out. And even in open prisons, we're seeing people go through what was called the TPRS scheme, where people with a relatively short period of time to go in their sentence were being moved into open conditions. But they're there for such a short period of time, they're not able to get release on temporary license. That process isn't able to work through. So actually, they're pretty frustrated as well. So really, the overcrowding has affected every bit of the system. And finally, just to say that prisoners often, as part of their sentence, as part of their sentence plan, that they'll need to show they've made progress at when they get in front of the parole board. What we often see is that prisoners say, look, I've been told I've got to do this course, but the prison I'm currently in isn't doing the course. And that's a huge issue for me. So I'm now just sitting here waiting, unable to do the course. So when I come to the parole board, they're going to say, you haven't done this course, therefore we're not going to grant you parole. And again, that's a cause of lots of anxiety amongst prisoners.
And then when they are released, I think your report found that 20 to 30% were homeless on release from the SDS 40 cohort. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, and that's not at all that's not at all unusual. Sadly, we see lots of men going out homeless. And of course, what then happens, Danny, is I remember we were in Chelmsford Prison, a guy on the Monday, the team talked to a guy on the Monday who was going out that afternoon. He goes out and he says his last words are, I'll be back before the end of the week. Sure enough, there he was on the Wednesday. He was going out homeless. It was almost inevitable that he was going to breach his license conditions, and therefore he was going to be yanked back into custody. So in terms of being able to resettle successfully, people's chances are hugely diminished if they haven't got somewhere safe to live, they haven't got something to do, and they're not being kept healthy, whether that's physically healthy, mentally healthy, or being able to stay away from drugs.
Keep those questions coming in. We've got some questions already that we will come to very shortly, but do keep those questions coming in to us. We will try and get them answered. Just want to turn, Charlie, if I may, to the women's estate. Obviously, you know, the vast bulk of prisoners across England and Wales are male, but you do have some concerns about the conditions for female inmates. Particular the use of force, and I think the lack of training and appreciation of the risks of self-harm. Can you spell out what your concerns there?
Well, I think really, use of force is something that we're often concerned about. That the way in which prisoners are being dealt with, the way in which systems are supposed to operate, often don't. We often come across body-worn cameras that aren't being used properly. So what it means is that where it should be working well, very often we find that it simply isn't.
And I mean, do you see any sort of improvement in conditions in the women's prisons that you've been in? There is a sort of a push and certainly a move, and there has been for years, to get fewer women sent into custody. And we know that there are some pilot schemes of sort of halfway houses and so on. Are you seeing any improvement there?
We were in Eastwood Park actually just last week, and it was good to see under a really strong governor that there was progress beginning to be made. But look, we put out a thematic report called Time to Care earlier in the year, and that was showing some really worrying findings about some of the conditions within the women's estate. So they were telling us that they couldn't get access to things like clothes. We are now told that women are not going to be forced to wash their underwear in their sinks, that they now will be able to use the washing machines to wash their underwear. But that was one of these strange anomalies, which is correct in. There are very limited amounts of specifically female clothing out there within the women's estate as well. So we still come across women wearing cut down male clothing. and and really levels of self-harm at 9 times higher than in male prisons. And when we ask women what the issues are with that, very often what they're telling us is that it's about the basic stuff. It's about someone coming to talk to them, finding out how they are. It's about making sure that their visit's actually going to happen when it's supposed to happen. Some really simple things that we are beginning to see in some of the better women's prisons that we hope will be expanded more widely.
Just briefly, before we come on to your questions, just want to ask about young offenders and the under 18s. You pointed out in your annual report about serious violence that you're witnessing in young offender institutions. What are your specific concerns there, and what needs to be done to address that in your view?
Well, we're often seeing what are really reckless levels of sometimes group violence on individual prisoners, and sadly also on prison officers as well, and that is enormously concerning. And there are a number of reasons for this. Part of it is just about maintaining standards, and what we find is that often it's not really clear what the rules are within an establishment. It's not really clear about what the prison is prepared to tolerate and what it isn't prepared to tolerate. Very often we find that actually, if you do the right thing, there aren't really many benefits from that, both in YOIs, but also in adult prisons. People say, look, if I get on the enhanced level, if I'm a really well-behaved prisoner, it doesn't actually make any difference to my day-to-day existence. And we know what a big motivation that children can be really motivated by having the right things in place, the right incentives in place. Often we don't see that. We see staff who are trying incredibly hard, but often don't have that experience to be able to look after the children who are in their care. And we see that the provision of education is often really poor. So if people are locked in their cells for 20 hours a day, the real danger then is that when they come out, these are young, fit men who've got loads of energy. They come out frustrated. They've been having rows with other prisoners up and down the corridor. And it's almost inevitable you get kind of an explosion for that short period of time. And what we're also seeing is they're not getting into education. They're not learning the kind of skills that are going to help them to be successful when they come out. In fact, most worryingly, what they're learning is the skills that are going to help them to cope best with a life in prison. There is an exception, which is Park YOI in South Wales, which continues to be a high-performing establishment, doing really well. Kids are out of their cells for 10 to 12 hours a day. They're into education. The attendance is really good, and there is a real sense of productivity about that place. So it doesn't have to be like it is. There are some shining examples that show what can be done with the right leadership, with the right staff, and the right commitment and regime.
What's the ingredient then at Park that differentiates itself from the other YOIs? Because that's been consistently performing well. It's a private sector prison as well, isn't it? Is it to do with more autonomy for the leaders
I
there?
think particularly in the case of Park, I think there's a number of things that have made it successful. I think the first thing is that the directors of it sits within a much bigger adult prison, which has certainly had its problems, certainly in the last year. But actually, the directors of Park have always made sure that they don't touch the youth resorts. So it's always been relatively well resourced. They've never taken staff out to staff the main prison. The staff there are very experienced. There's a really clear ethos, culture, way of doing things, standards and expectations in there. So if you come in, and they sometimes take kids who've had a really difficult time in other jails, when they come into Park, what they come into is an environment which is settled, which is calm, and where the expectations of them are really clear. And that when they go to education, they're getting a curriculum that suits them. But there's also a bunch of really good enrichment type activities afterwards as well. So everything from D&V going on there, to sports activities, to really good access to the gym. I mean, I was there, and I walked into the kitchen at Park last time I visited, and there were some kids who were doing some cooking in order to be able to give food to homeless people out in Bridgend, where the prison's located. So just a sense of purpose about the place and a really committed staff.
Well, that's good to hear. Some positive signs, certainly. Right, we're going to turn now to your questions. And we've got a whole series of them coming up. So let's start with drones and drugs, which is where we started the conversation. This is from Liz Norris. Have you seen any examples of where the problem of drones is being tackled really effectively? She says, I'm thinking particularly within any older jails where the infrastructure wasn't built with this problem in mind, but they have responded to the issue and it's working. So any examples of good action against drones?
Well, sometimes it is actually, Danny, just a matter of luck. So it depends on the build of the building originally. So what kind of windows got put in? What direction do windows face? Do they look out over the wall? Do they look inside internally? And that can certainly help. I mean, we recently inspected Lincoln, where which is a prison which has really had its problems in the past. They had drone activity coming in. They had drugs getting into the prison, but actually you've got a really experienced staff there. You've got a governor who's really clear about expectations. You've got a security team who's working closely with the safety team in that prison. And what they were able to do is disrupt the drone activity very quickly. So move prisoners on to different cells, make sure they're really bearing down on what's going on. So part of drones is about getting the basics right. Are you mowing the lawn so that packages can't be dropped in the grass? Are you getting rid of rubbish so that packages can't be disguised as rubbish? When you do your checks of the grounds, are you doing those checks really thoroughly and really well? So it's partly the physical security. CCTV's got to work. You've got to have netting that's effective. You've got to have windows that can't be broached. But it's also about having staff who are really focused and doing it properly. And it's also about having a security department who's operating well. And then on top of that, what we hope is that there'll be more technological solutions as well.
I think we heard that there's been an advert has gone out for some drone specialists to be recruited by the prison service. Is that right? That would seem to be a little bit late in the day.
Well, I mean, it's great to hear that there is some action being taken, but certainly the drones have been around a long time. My predecessor, but I think Lord Ramsbottom in 2016 warned about the threat of drones coming into prison.
Wow.
So this isn't anything new, and really since the end of COVID, drones has become a major issue for prisons.
Still on the subject of drones, Carol Davies says, is it right that drones can be blocked from flying in certain areas, and can that be implemented around prisons?
I think that there's potential for some technological solutions to be used, but what you're up against is criminal gangs who are constantly trying new things. They're constantly trying to adapt. They're constantly trying to change the way in which they attack prisons. So that drone technology is moving very quickly. So technological solutions are part of the solution, but they're never going to be the be all and end all. Physical security and the capability of staff are also essential.
Last one on drones from Andy Keane Downs. He says, given that drones are increasingly a feature of modern warfare, are you aware of any consideration being given to making use of our military to target hardened prisons from drones? I don't know if you are aware, or if anyone would tell you.
Well, it's great to hear from Andy, and he does amazing work at PACT, and we often comment on the great stuff that they do around the country. I haven't heard from that. I doubt they tell me if there was something going on, and if they did tell me, I wouldn't tell anybody else. So no, we haven't heard anything about that at the moment.
Okay. I've got a question from Alex Hewson about Frankland Prison. He points out that the report on close supervision centres last year was pretty positive from the inspectorate. But in light of the recent Frankland incident, that awful incident in which several prison officers were badly injured by a prisoner, do you believe this represents a fundamental shift requiring a reassessment of how we hold and manage those deemed the most dangerous, or do you see it as a tragic but isolated case from which lessons need to be learned within that specific unit? I think that incident wasn't in a close supervision centre. I think it was in one of the
it was actually a separation centre. Yeah, and they are different. I mean, we were very impressed with the close supervision centres around the country. Actually, we visited all of them. We thought the capability of staff was incredibly high. The processes by which people would get moved into them were really impressive, very thorough. and also the processes by which people could move out from them were also really thorough as well. So and there is a spectrum from somewhere like Wakefield, where prisoners are not allowed, or very, very rarely allowed, to do any mixing with each other, some really, really risky men, to other, as they begin to work their way through the system, other places where they're allowed to have a little bit more freedom, where they're able to associate a little bit more with risk assessed other prisoners. So, there are some very dangerous, very risky men in prisons. We were generally impressed by what happened there. Now, look, we're waiting to see what came from the separation centre incident at Frankland, and certainly when we inspected those centres about two or 3 years ago, we actually found again that standards were generally pretty good there. In fact, we were more worried about Wood Hill, which closed soon after our visit, than we were about Frankland. But we'll wait and see. Jonathan Hall is doing his report, and we'll wait to see what went wrong there, and hopefully get to the bottom of what was a really appalling incident.
I know one idea has been mooted, which is a sort of a maximum security style prison along the lines of Supermax, of what they have in the United States. Any thoughts about that, Charlie?
Well, ultimately, I mean, we would, if one was built, we would inspect the treatment of conditions in prisoners in those jails. There is, in effect, the opportunity to be able to put people who are very risky into very, very high levels of confinement, where their ability to mix, their ability to commit offences is restricted a lot. But ultimately, that's a decision that the government would need to make in the future. But it would be a huge change from the way in which the English prison system has been run and set up over the last really 150 years.
Just out of interest, and have you given evidence to Jonathan Hall as part of his review?
We've been in communication, yes, indeed. Yes.
Right, that's good to know. Okay, turning to some more questions now on leadership and confidence in the Prison and Probation Service. This is from Liza Durkin. She says, Chief Inspector, do you have any confidence that HMPPS can pivot and respond with the speed and innovation that is required to sort the issues that they can control, as opposed to those that you acknowledge are enduringly difficult due to overcrowding and capacity challenges?
Well, I'm not. It's always going to be a Cinderella service to some extent, prisons. They are always going to be strapped for cash. You're never going to have a government minister who's going to stand up in the House of Commons and say, we're going to give more, we're going to take money away from the NHS in order to better fund our prisons. So to some extent, that is an issue that continues to be faced by prisons. And often what we find is that it is some real fundamental things about infrastructure in jails that just need to be fixed. But it's also the processes by which they are fixed. So I remember a governor telling me that they had to have temporary, I think it was two very large temporary fridges in place, and that they'd spent 60 grand on having to hire them because they weren't allowed to actually buy some new ones. And in the end, they'd spent more on the cost of hiring them than they would have done had they actually just gone out and been able to buy new ones. At Lincoln Prison, they've got a boiler house, which they built 7 years ago, which still hasn't got a boiler in it. They're still relying on temporary facilities. Wandsworth has got a healthcare centre, which opened, was supposed to open many years ago. And there's this great white elephant of a building sitting within Wandsworth, which has never had a prisoner walk through the doors. So it is partly about money, but it's also about the way in which resources can be used, and actually making sure that stuff happens more quickly, that governors have got a say over things that do go on within their jail, and that some of this really basic infrastructure stuff that can be fixed does get fixed, rather than just spending more and more money on things like temporary bodge-up solutions.
But do you have the confidence that HMPPS can respond to those challenges?
Well, we'll look forward to seeing. We'll keep reporting on treatment and conditions, and hopefully things will begin to get better.
Okay, Liza, I hope you feel you've got an answer to that question. Here's another one from Jamie Bennett. He says, is there more that HMPPS can do to build a culture of good leadership rather than what you describe as plodding managerialism? And he says, could the current House of Lords inquiry into prison leadership and culture influence a new approach? So is there more that HMPPS can do in that regard?
Well, certainly we engaged with that inquiry, and we were really pleased to see it happen from that committee, and we look forward to seeing what comes out as a result of that. I mean, I go back to my time as a head teacher and the things that I was able to do. And I think that sense of being accountable for stuff but not responsible, that is such a frustration. And I think we've had some sort of tentative steps in the past of allowing greater autonomy for governors. And then there always tends to be a yank back on the reins. But ultimately, you cannot run individual prisons from Whitehall. You have to allow people the trust and the responsibility to be able to run their prison in their own way, and then to hold them, to make sure they're properly held to account. And I think that is one of the issues with our prison system is that there's lots of top-down governance which works the whole way down, that people aren't trusted. There isn't a degree of subsidiarity that you would want to have when it comes to decision making. So what you often get in prisons in England and Wales is a sort of passive compliance. So people kind of do what they're supposed to do because they're good and dutiful people, rather than really being able to unleash the great talent that we see in prisons. And it just feels frustrating to me that you've got people who are running someone like Wormwood Scrubs, 1,000 prisoners, whatever it is, £25 million budget. There is enormous responsibility and weight on the shoulders of that governor, and yet they don't always have the tools to be able to do the job in the way that they would want. And it's partly about having the money in place, but it's also partly about having that level of control, so that they are spending every day in a way that is most productive for that prison to be able to improve.
Isn't the concern, though, from the leadership at successive Ministry of Justice secretaries and ministers, that if they don't have that control, a prison will do something that will make damaging headlines or actually lead to detrimental outcomes for prisoners, and they'll have to step in, which is why they want that central control. Isn't that the balance that they're
I can understand. I absolutely understand the instinct, and I bang on about schools and prisons. They're not the same, and I understand the risks are very different within prisons. So, but however, having said that, actually, what we know is, and what the evidence is really clear about, and Jamie himself has spoken eloquently about this, is that where you just mandate mediocrity, you get mediocrity. Where you're able to really unleash talent, where you're able to give people the freedom in order to be able to run their place in the way that they think right, provided they're being held to account for what they do. So making sure the checks and balances are in place, so that, you give people trust, but you also make them accountable for what they're able to do. Where you put responsibility and you put accountability together in the same place, then you're able to really make a difference. But where people feel they've always got to look over their shoulder before they can make any decisions, that inevitably constrains people's ambition and their ability to be able to do really transformative stuff. And it is no accident that some of the best prisons in the country are actually run by the private sector, because when you talk to those governors, they will say that I have freedoms, I'm able to do stuff, despite the constraints of the contract that my colleagues in the public sector are not able to do.
Well, I can hear your passion coming across loud and clear, and I think everyone can, about the need to sort of unshackle those chains from petty France. On purposeful activity, a question from Paul Norris. Charlie, what in your view are the barriers that are still preventing purposeful activity from improving across the estate?
Well, it's a really good question. There are a number of things, and starting with, I think the overall attitude about purposeful activity that we often come across, and I think it kind of pervades the prison system. So we inspect 4 different areas which we score: safety, respect, purposeful activity, and preparation for release. And I know for a fact that if we give a low score for a prison for safety, that is taken much more seriously. People are much more upset by that than if we give a low score for purposeful activity. Now, part of the reason for that is that governors, going back to what I was saying before, governors are accountable for purposeful activity, but they're not actually responsible for commissioning in providers to come and do the work. That's let through central government contracts. So that's an issue. But I think the prison service as a whole needs to really orientate towards the part of its job, which is about making people less likely to reoffend when they come out. And that means giving them the training they need, giving them the education they need, giving them the skills and the work readiness that they need in order to come out and be successful. And we still see very often prisoners get to work at 9:30, then by 11:30 they're already heading back onto the wing. And we find that people who are doing wing cleaning jobs are often completely underemployed. They'll do 20 minutes, an hour or so of cleaning, and then just sit around at the end of the landing, vaping and chatting to their mates. That isn't really getting people work ready in the way that we would want them to be doing. And I think also that where we find attendance is really poor. So for whatever reason, either because there aren't enough staff to escort prisoners to education, or because staff have had to go out because they're doing bed watches or they're doing escorts to hospitals, those kind of things. What we find is the first thing that gets cancelled is education. And so what it means is if you're some bright, shiny-eyed teacher who gets a job in prison education because you want to make a difference, what we find in many cases, if you don't know who's going to turn up, you don't know if anybody's going to turn up, you don't know if the prison's going to get locked down, you don't get any consistency or real investment in what you're trying to do from the leadership within the jail, from the leadership within the service, then the danger is you just vote with your feet and you just go off and find another area that you can make a difference. So it really would involve a full-scale reorientation towards purposeful activity. We're just reviewing our reading thematic that we did in 2022 with our colleagues at Ofsted, and we're going to some jails where actually there's a real difference been made. It's been really good to see. Somewhere like Ranby we visited recently, some really encouraging work, well done to them. But we're also going to other jails where people are coming in unable to read. They're doing their sentence 2-3 years and they're coming out unable to read at the end of that. And that just simply can't be acceptable. It's not that hard to teach people to read unless they've got really, really serious learning difficulties. It's not that hard to teach people to read. And yet loads of people, we know that 50% roughly of prisoners are functionally illiterate, and there's far more that we could do about that.
Thank you for that question and answer. I think there's a question from Karen Ryan that sort of touches on that you've probably answered by your previous remarks. So turning to a question now from Jane Rigby, the role of the voluntary sector. She says, I'm relatively new to this sector, joining Shannon Trust as CEO late last month. I'm interested to know what examples of effective collaboration between prisons and charities stood out in your inspections this year.
Well, it's a really good question. And first of all, a warm welcome to the new role, and we look forward to meeting. We see lots of voluntary organisations doing some brilliant stuff in prisons. I've already talked about the work that PAC does. We often are very complimentary of the work that the Shannon Trust does, and lots of other organisations who go into jails and work really well. There's a number of things that make that successful. The first thing is the real buy-in from leadership. So what you need is leaders within the prison who are really bought into what the third sector organisation is trying to achieve. That's really critical. That immediately helps to encourage partnership. But it isn't just partnership at leadership level. It's also about partnership on the ground, because actually you have to get the buy-in from prison officers who are actually going to be doing much of the work as well. And so it is about leaders being really clear about what their expectation is, both from those private sector organisations, clear contracting of responsibilities. This is what we want you to do. This is how we want you to make a difference. But also making sure that the other cogs, the other bits of machinery within the prison are working together to be able to support those third sector organisations when they come into jails as well. And I think the big frustration that I often find when I talk to people is that they work really well with Governor X, who had a really good relationship with him or her, and then that person leaves and the kind of air goes out of the initiative a little bit. James Timpson has talked about trying to increase governor tenure so they stay in jails for longer. And certainly if you go to someone like Wandsworth, I think it's had 10, 11, even 12 governors this century. It's really hard for third sector organisations to really be able to get the traction that they need to be really transformative.
Thank you. There's a question about the children's estate from Sean Common. He says, the levels of violence and children being locked in their cells almost all day, every day. He says, is this down to lack of staffing, or as you mentioned, the quality and knowledge and experience of leadership and staffing? What do you put it down to?
Well, it's a great question from Sean, who's a distinguished Ofsted inspector. Um, I think it's a bit of both. So it is about being really clear about what youth prisons are for. What are we actually trying to achieve? What is the culture that we want to set up here? What are our expectations of the children who are in our custody? So I think that's really critical. It's critical to have enough staff who are really well trained in the front line. But unusually within the public sector, this isn't necessarily about funding and money. What we find is there are, I mean, when we inspected Cookham Wood, which is now closed down, I think there were 77 boys in the place and more than 350 staff members. There was actually a shortage of prison officers on the ground to be able to actually do the work every day. But there were all kinds of other organizations, all kinds of other people working in the jail who weren't actually able to who weren't able to do what they were supposed to do because the boys were actually locked in their cells for so long. So, yeah, sometimes we find that leadership teams within the youth estate are enormous, and it's something that we've been encouraging a lot, is that you've got key work not happening, that really critical component of the youth custody service's ambition, which is to have far more key work, so you really get to know an individual. Well, it turns out that managers don't do the key work. It's left entirely to prison officers. You've got these very big managerial teams. Why wouldn't they be getting involved, rolling their sleeves up, taking on 1 or 2 kids every month as well? So it isn't a resource thing. It's really about focusing on the culture, getting that right, and then making sure the people who are working there are properly trained. Look, these are tough places to work. There are some really challenging kids there. And when things go wrong in one of these youth prisons, they can really unravel quickly. So learn from the best, learn from what places like Park are doing, but because actually what you see is children who've really struggled in other establishments can go to somewhere like Park and they can be successful.
I want to come on to a question from John Collins on education and technology. He says the access to laptops, tablets and the internet have the potential to expand access to education, complementing face-to-face learning. But he says your report says few prisons make good use of information technology in learning. Could you expand on this? What should the Probation and Prison Service be doing to make digital technology more widely available? That question from John Collins.
Yeah, well, very good to hear from John, and John does brilliant work in prisons with a huge focus on education. I mean, I think technology has taken a long time to take off in prisons, and you can understand some of the reticence, that you don't want prisoners having unfettered access to the internet, those sorts of things. So absolutely understand that. We are seeing some jails where there is greater use of technology. So you go to something like Wayland, you go to some of the youth estate where prisoners do have laptops, and they really appreciate that, and they really appreciate the things they can do. But actually the functionality is pretty limited, to be honest. So when it comes to actually what they could be doing on education, what you could be feeding in to those prisoners, there isn't nearly as much as we would like to see. What you find with prisoners who are doing things like open university degrees or other sorts of courses is they have to do all their correspondence on pen and paper, sending stuff through the post. Well, they are the last people on the planet, or the last people in the country, certainly, to be doing their education in that shape. So risk assessed and making sure that you have good technology that works, I think there are great possibilities. The one other thing I would say, my one caveat about technology, is let's not have technology being an alternative to human face-to-face contact, because actually that contact is really important. And if people are just left in their cells with a laptop and some work to do, they're not going to do it with the best will in the world. So that human contact is important, but technology, and I hope that in 5, 10, 15 years time, that the use of technology in prisons will have been transformed.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. There are 3 more questions to come. So reasonably brief answers if possible.
Will do.
Charlie. On suicide and self-harm, this from Helen Ranasingh says, we are seeing increasing levels of self-harm and suicide in prisons. What do you see are the reasons for this, and what further work is needed by the prison service to reduce deaths?
Well, sadly, deaths are not uncommon in prisons, and we see a number. I think 90 prisoners took their own life last year, and each one of those is an absolute tragedy, not only for them, not only for their families, but also for the prison staff who come across that. And every governor, every prison officer will remember those awful experiences and will take them with them throughout their careers. Uh, Sometimes it's about some really basic things. We know that people are at their most vulnerable when they first come into prison, and making sure that any red flags are picked up very quickly. So, has this person been inside before? If they haven't, that's a red flag. Have they committed an offence which is going to see them alienated from their family, so that they can't get visits and they're not able to have anybody who knows that they're there? Again, that's a red flag. Are they getting out of their cell, or are they just being locked and left for long periods of time? Again, that's another red flag. So it's really about having staff who are aware of the prisoners in their care, and there are really good processes in place to make sure that people do get properly looked after. But again, things like overcrowding, where staff are rushed off their feet trying to meet the needs and trying to deal with so many prisoners at the same time. Again, that's the kind of thing just feeds that feeds the sense of despair that people get. It's also about having really good mental health treatment within prisons, and mental health in general in prisons is much better than it was. It used to be one of the worst things. If you look at our reports earlier in the century, healthcare is often shockingly bad. So things have improved on that front, but it is making sure that healthcare is good, and that there is good close working relationships between prison officers and healthcare as well.
A quick question on immigration detention from Stuart Ross. Do you feel that the introduction of IRPs, I've got to say, I don't know what IRPs are, in immigration removal centres has helped drive improvements? Oh,
yes.
I'm being told the independent review of progress.
There you go. Yes. So we have these in prison. So if we go to a jail that we're worried about, we can then go back within 8 to 12 months, and we have a look and see how they're getting on. And it's been a really good way, I think, of helping to keep the spotlight on a prison about which we've got lots of concerns. So we thought, actually, and we had negotiations with the Home Office, why wouldn't we do this in establishments as well? Well, I think it has worked, because we inspected Harmondsworth last year, and the place was in a real mess. We went back for a review of progress earlier on this year, and it was great to see that actually there have been some substantial improvements through the provider, the excellent director at that place, and also the Home Office working really well to make the place safer, more effective, and more responsive to some of the most vulnerable detainees.
Just before we come on to the final question, there's one question from me. We haven't talked about sex offenders, who make up an increasing proportion of the number of people in prison. You've mentioned in your report not enough is being done to reduce the risks. Better training is needed for staff, and also finding employment on release is a real difficulty. There's a report today about chemical castration. We know the government has been keen on looking at this and making it mandatory. What are your thoughts on that, Charlie, if I may, and also the wider issues for people convicted of sexual offences?
Well, certainly this is a population that's growing. It also tends to be a population which is often older than the norm as well. So these are very expensive people to look after in prison, because they often need adapted cells. You go to a jail like the Verne, and there's a whole wing of very elderly men in what is more like a care home than really a prison. So there is a big cost. What we found is that in some prisons there isn't really much focus on the offence. That you can spend your time in prison and no one really is challenging you. No one is looking for the sort of offence mirroring behaviour that we want to see. In other jails we've been to, Stafford, really impressive. We went to Rye Hill, again, really impressive. Really thinking about these men, thinking about the risks that they pose. And then just recently we inspected Haverig. It's not within this reporting era. Where they were doing some fantastic work with engaging with employers to really think about what are the jobs that men who come out having served sentences for sexual offences, what are the kind of jobs they can get, and their employment on release statistics were far better than we see with other jails. So that was really encouraging to see, and we'll keep pushing the prison service to continue to think about how you get these men into employment. And it is often a national issue, because people are often housed in prisons a long way from home. In terms of chemical castrations, look, it's something that some prisoners can take on voluntarily, but let's wait and see whether it actually becomes a reality, whether it's mandated in the future.
You're doubtful about whether that could work?
Let's wait and see. I think there are various challenges that may be faced.
Very diplomatic. Right, final question. This is a good one to end on, from Sam Gluckstein. There is a new permanent secretary in the Ministry of Justice this week. I think it's Jo Farrar. What should be her #1 priority for prisons as she begins to grip her portfolio? So the #1 priority for Jo Farrar. She might be listening. She might get a readout of this call. What's her #1 priority?
Well, I mean, Jo Farrar, welcome back, and it will be good to work with Jo again. I would say the #1 thing to really think about is, how are you going to enable governors to do their job? What are the constraints that are in the way of really good leaders being able to do their job well? What are those constraints which are irksome but necessary? And what are those constraints that you can relieve, that you can lift off, that you can allow the many brilliant people we see in prisons to flourish?
Thank you very much, Charlie. Thank you, everyone, for your questions, some brilliant range of questions. Thank you, Charlie, for your responses. Just a reminder, a recording of this event will be made available on the HMI Prisons website, and the full report, Charlie's annual report, that can also be found on the HMI Prisons website, alongside all of the inspector's survey analysis, judgment scores, and notable positive practice from this year. Although this is a report that highlights a lot of concerns, a lot of worries about prisons, there are some real beacons of hope, and there are some really high-performing prisons. So my message would be to others and to leaders: look at those examples and try and take something from that good practice and implement it in the institutions that you run. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Danny. Thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.